Right, now in an earlier lesson we looked at the skyline of Venice. By simplifying a whole cluster of classical buildings, it became quite straightforward to paint a very appealing picture. Now in Liverpool city centre in William Brown Street there are a whole cluster of magnificent buildings. You can just see the museums, there's the Central Library, and here is a very famous art gallery called the Walker Art Gallery. And that's what we're going to concentrate on here. Right, now when I'm looking at this sort of view to paint, immediately a couple of questions arise in my mind, quite apart from how to deal with the complexities of the buildings themselves. First of all, potentially you've got a magnificent focal point here in the fountain. So that means that the buildings behind simply become a backdrop, and you need to simplify them and pale them off and concentrate on the lights and darks and the details here. Or you could use this area here as a focal point with the main entrance between the two statues. Now in that case you need to subdue the fountain's impact. It needs to be there because it's an integral part of this scene, but at the same time you don't want it to be so dominant that it actually takes away from the main focal point around here. Now that's actually the view that I'm going to do on this, and what I'm going to do is, although I'm going to paint this fountain, I'm going to paint it in fairly subdued colours and use it in fact as a lead-in. But let's have a look at this simplification thing and these so-called complicated buildings. Well, let's just see how uncomplicated we can make them. If we put our little sheet of acetate on, as I've done in previous tutorials, you can see here that we can draw around the outline of the main shapes, and all we're really dealing with is a few, and I mean a few, oblongs and squares, a few triangles, certainly no more than about half a dozen triangles for the fountain, and a bit of a sausage shape for the base of the fountain. Right, now just so we can see that a little bit clearer, I'm just going to put a sheet of plain paper over the picture for a moment, and you can see now how simple that very complex cluster of buildings can be made to be. Now all we're looking at then is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, half a dozen simple oblongs and squares for the frontages of the buildings, and then a few little smaller oblongs and mostly triangles for the rest of the picture. One thing that I'm just conscious of is that William Brown Street is actually constructed on quite a steep hill that runs down here. It actually runs down towards the original Mersey Tunnel. Now you can see I put two figures, or two half figures, on this separate sheet of acetate. Now the beauty of the acetate, of course, is I can move these figures around and decide where the best spot is. That's okay, but I think it's a little bit too central. That's there, that's fine, but it sort of gets in the way of the door, and it means that all of the activity is on this side of the picture. And so I'm really looking over at this side of the picture, and I'm probably going to put them about there. A, because I think it gives a better balance to the picture, but also it provides a visual block for the eye going out of the picture here. Now for this tutorial I'm using a piece of Bockingford tinted paper. It's actually a biscuit colour. It probably looks quite a creamy yellow to you, and that means that I don't have to use any raw sienna. Not that I have any problem with raw sienna, but what I'm going to concentrate on here is using basically two colours, and that's ultramarine blue and burnt umber, in different strengths and mixes to give me all of the tones that I want. Because I've got this fairly strong yellowy colour in the background coming through, that's going to give me a nice warm background, but any patches that I leave unpainted will also come through as this nice basic warm colour. Now if you're looking and think, oh hang on, that picture looks awfully complex, what happened to the triangles? Well, there they are. There's a triangle there, there's a square there, there's the other square, and the other square, even though this is a round building. So, oh, and here's some more of the triangles that we've started off with. But what I've done is done this on a separate piece of paper and then traced it down onto the watercolour paper when I know I'm going to be able then to get a fairly clean drawing. And as for the fountain, these figures here are being kept very simple. You can see there's not even any arms and obvious legs, but they do look like two figures sitting underneath the fountain, contemplating or maybe reading the paper, I don't know, whatever the original sculptor had in mind. Normally, to be honest, I wouldn't paint any of these pillars in, and much of this other work up here, I wouldn't paint it. I'd go straight in with the brush. It's actually a lot easier that way, and it gives you a much more fluid, a much freer picture. But I'm conscious that if you're not used to doing that, then a little bit of hand holding in this case will do no harm, and then hopefully you might have a go at this or something else similar to this without doing so much detail, and see if you can paint the detail in with the brush. Oh, and as for brushes, well, I'm going to use the 1-inch flat brush because that'll cover many of the verticals in the picture very, very quickly and freely. And I'm also going to use the number 8 round brush because that'll let me, with its fine point, it'll let me pick up some of these finer details here and there. Right, now you can see I've just dotted in, dabbed in a few little bits of ultramarine blue. I'm leaving the rest of the sky completely untouched, and I'm going to use the yellow of the paper as warm clouds, if you like, because I really don't want anything complicated in this sky that's going to compete with what is really quite a busy scene, even though we're going to simplify quite a lot. So the base colour you can see is this pale creamy brown, and that's where burnt umber is ideal when you thin it right down. So I'm going to put that over most of the picture or most of the buildings, and then as and when I need to, I'm going to add some darks to start giving us the shapes of the pillars and some of the shadows underneath. So here we go, and you can see how very, very simply I'm dealing with this here. I'm only putting the top part of this in because there are some vertical pillars that need to go in a little later on, so we'll deal with those details in a minute or two. Now, although the building is essentially the same colour throughout, you can see that I'm actually just painting in the separate shapes, and that helps to give a little bit of form, a little bit of modelling to the picture, or to the building anyway, and helps to separate out for you the individual shapes in a quite an attractive way. What I'll do here and there is, while I've got a chance, while the paper is still slightly damp, and certainly with the far side of the pillars, I'm just going to touch in like that. Now the good thing in here is, because I've added different amounts of water and there's still a little bit of ultramarine blue has been left on the brush when I've mixed this colour, it makes a subtly but quite useful differentiation between the two colours of the two buildings here. Again, even using the corner of the brush, you can get quite a nice square edge where you want it, even on those little bits up there. And the beauty of this, of course, is that part of this paint is now dry and part of it isn't, so we will get that nice varied effect of bits blending together and bits being hard edged, which is super. It's just what we want. And just a touch mainly of ultramarine blue with a little tiny touch of the burnt umber. That'll give us a nice grey colour for that roof, and we'll just do it inside there as well, where it'll show through some of the of those pillars. Just see the way I'm painting the brush, very, very pale. There we are, that's nice, some little bit of variety. That'll blend and spread now with the paint that's on the paper, or the water that's on the paper. Give us a nice little hint of variety. Now all you can see is I've either put large blocks of colour in, use that for the pillars, stabbed in to give us some thin blue-grey lines for some of the shadows, and that's really all that's been involved. With burnt umber as well, it's quite easy to lift out burnt umber. It's not particularly a staining colour, so if you make a mistake, don't worry about it, it'll probably come out. The other thing about using the round brush as well is that it gives a nice contrast with the angular shapes and the angular strokes that the 1-inch brush have created in these distant buildings. Now you can see I'm using the same colour to touch in these statues, and the reason for that is that I'm going to put some white gouache on these statues when the time comes to give them a little bit of highlight and sunlight, and this colour will actually then become the shadow area of the white statues. But of course, it's the lighter area of the fountain here, so it helps to all tie everything together. I'm also going to do that on these stone pillars. These bits I'm doing here, slightly darker colour, they're not going to be the darkest darks on the fountain, but what they are going to do is to give a nice effect of, if you like, a third dimension of colour rather than just light and shade.